Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 28th installment of the Galen Data Medical Device Innovation Webinar Series. I'll be your host today. My name is Dwayne Mancini. I'm the CEO and Managing Partner at Project MedTech. Today, we'll be hearing from Kyle Rose at Rook Quality Systems for a discussion on designing for compliance, software as a medical device versus physical devices. Within this webinar, you'll be hearing about what testing is required for software as medical device products versus hardware products. How does that testing change if there is hardware involved with the medical device? When you should begin the planning and testing phase for your medical device product? What the best practices for documenting your validation results for FDA and ISO review are, and how you should incorporate usability into your validation for software as a medical device and hardware devices. First, a few housekeeping slides and some information on Galen Data. Galen Data is an FDA compliant cloud for medical device manufacturers. The Galen Cloud provides a configurable platform for device to cloud connectivity that is compliant to FDA, HIPAA, and CE mark standards. The company is ISO 13485 certified, and the product on AWS is High Trust certified as well. Founded by seasoned medical device professionals, the company's goal is to make medical device cloud connectivity available to all at a fraction of the cost while shaving months off the development timeline. Galen Data allows medical device companies to stay medical device companies and not become IT companies. Some quick logistics. If you do have a question, on the right-hand side of your screen, I believe there's a spot to drop questions in there. If you submit those, if they're relevant to the current slide we're on, I'll bring them up to Kyle. If not, we'll ask them at the end. There also is a handout section there, which you'll see some information on Galen Data, and then also a white paper on device to cloud connectivity. As a reminder, you'll receive a recording of this webinar via email, and feel free to follow up with us should you have any additional questions. Now, our guest today is Kyle Rose. Kyle did provide a bio, and I updated it myself. So Kyle is an avid U.S. men's soccer national team fan, an Arsenal fan, and a medical device expert specializing in development of efficient quality systems for small and startup medical device companies. As president of Rook Quality Systems, Kyle works as a contract quality manager for multiple medical device companies, overseeing overall quality strategy, ensuring compliance through documentation and auditing services. Kyle is a certified quality auditor and has regulatory and submission experience for a variety of markets, including FDA, CE mark, Health Canada, and CFDA. Kyle encourages the simplification of quality systems to reduce the quality burden and improve compliance through training and efficient quality system design. With that being said, Kyle, the virtual floor is all yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Dwayne. Thanks for throwing in the soccer allegiances as well. Definitely got a good year going for Arsenal, so we're hoping to keep that up. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining. And thanks again, Galen, for hosting this webinar. Really excited to talk to everyone today about the topic, which is designing for compliance, how to improve your QMS and validation testing strategies for SaMD versus physical devices. So we're going to talk a little bit about differences, similarities, and what to do to get a strong foundation in place to make sure you're designing your device or software properly, and that's leading to the correct testing, and there's very little hiccups along the way. As Dwayne said, I'm president of Rook Quality Systems. Rook Quality Systems just celebrated our 10-year anniversary last year. We have a team of 30 quality engineers and certified auditors that are experts in FDA, MedSAP, 1345, MDR, certifications, quality system requirements, all of these activities. We work with all types of medical devices, including SaMD, diagnostics, hardware devices, electrical devices, mechanical devices as well. And like Dwayne said as well, our main focus and the reason I started Rook Quality Systems was to help improve the efficiency and compliance of quality systems. A lot of times, especially with small or startup companies, we've seen that their quality system is too complicated, too much documentation, when really there is work that can be done to reduce the documentation burden, improve efficiency, and really right-size the quality system for the size of the company. There's no reason a 5 or 10 person company should have the same type of quality system as a 5 to 10,000 person company. So our job is to help companies make sure their quality systems are compliant and efficient for their product, for their size of their company. So we're going to talk about some of these tips and tricks and tools that we have developed and implemented for our clients, and see if those can help your device as well. Before we get too far into the details of designing for compliance and then into validation, just want to give a high-level overview of what a medical device is. I know when we do these webinars that there can be a wide range of experience for people listening and future listeners, so I want to make sure we have a strong foundation of what a medical device is, and then go into some of the details as well. So high-level definition of a medical device, and this is from the FDA, is any instrument, machine, contrivance, implant, or in vitro reagent that is intended to treat, cure, prevent, mitigate, or diagnose a disease. So it's very broad, but also can kind of narrow down specifically what you're doing. And within this scope, this can be hardware or software or a combination of the two. Devices can have multiple types of hardware or software, and depending on the use of these, design control and validation is likely required. There can be situations where certain aspects of your device are not considered under the scope of a medical device or quality system regulations, such as like a companion app or some sort of dashboard tied to your device, or some sort of feature that doesn't have a medicinal purpose. So you want to make sure when you're designing and working on your device that you plan out which aspects have which scope and what is required for the design of these features, and then what testing might be required. The planning phase is really important to make sure that you move through this process efficiently and there's not any major time loss or gaps in your plan. So make sure you know early on what the scope of your device and each feature is important for kind of the regulatory aspect leading to we've jumped into a medical device scope. On the high level medical device idea, we have the quality system regulation. So within the scope of medical device quality systems, the FDA has outlined the requirements for quality systems for medical devices in 21 CFR Part 820. And there's also an additional standard for international quality systems called ISO 1345. I'm sure some people have heard there is a plan to merge these two. Dwayne and I actually did a podcast about this a few months ago that talks about the plan for the QMSR, which will be the future of the FDA quality system regulations that also incorporate 1345. So in the near future, we're anticipating fall of 2023, there's going to be more details from the FDA on this plan. But currently, companies that are developing and then planning to validate a medical device should have a quality system in place. The way we coach and work with our companies is to really focus on this pre-market quality system. So the aspects of the quality system that are required in the design and development and testing phase. And then once your device is cleared or authorized by the FDA, then you will focus more on the post-market activities around complaint handling and traceability and things like that. So when you're designing and developing, there's key things we want to focus on the QMS foundation, and then roll in some of the post-market activities as you get closer to actually selling the device. These key things are listed here. The first one being the quality manual. So this is a high-level overview that outlines the entire scope of the quality system for your company and your device. It also identifies what markets you sell your device in, so if it's just US or international markets, and then identifies what aspects of the standards either do not apply or can be excluded from your quality system. So if you are a software as a medical device and you would not have any sterility options, right? So your device wouldn't be sterile, so you'd be able to exclude that section from the standard from your device. Also, it wouldn't be an implant if it's just a purely software device. So looking at the regulations and then planning ahead with your quality manual is key to kind of build this foundation for your quality system.
Kyle, real quick
Go ahead.
Real quick too, I dropped the link to the episode we did about the ISO
nice.
1345 into the chat. And oddly enough, that episode was sponsored by Galen, so full circle.
Perfect. Yeah. Yeah, so that has a lot of good information on the plans and what you would need to do to be compliant. A lot of that still would carry into this conversation as well. All of these items are shared between ISO and FDA currently, so they would follow along with the QMSR plans as well. The next kind of key aspect of quality systems in the pre-market scope is just document control. So making sure you have a process for documenting your quality system and control of documents as things get edited or changed. You need to make sure you have doc control process for this. The use of an EQMS is highly recommended. This makes the process much more streamlined and easier to complete. EQMS tools are great compared to, say, Dropbox or Google Drive. EQMS provides a framework for the standards and also takes a lot of the guesswork out of who needs a sign, are we using the latest version of documents, things like that that can get mixed up when you're using a paper system or like a hybrid like a Google Drive Dropbox system. Also important to have training, personnel and training procedures, even early on, make sure that people are properly trained. So this could be your software development engineers, this could be the people that are doing some of your bench testing, even in an R&D fashion. You still want to make sure they're trained on the QMS and know how to properly document everything in the QMS. This is kind of like a very high level overview of what's required in the QMS. If you ever have questions, obviously, previous webinars on the Rook website and also lots of content on our site as well on how to build your QMS for compliance. Other key aspects are really tied into this design and risk management and validation aspects. So having a procedure for design and development that outlines the requirements and phases of design and when you need to conduct design reviews. This should also incorporate relevant standards. So if you are a software device, the 62304 and the TIR 45 are likely applicable for your device. If you are a hardware/electrical device, or if you're an electrical device, the IEC 60601 likely applies to your device as well. So you want to make sure you incorporate these types of standards with your design and development process. Risk management's also key for your quality system. So having a template that meets the requirements of ISO and FDA, but then also ISO 14971, IEC 62304. This process, again, is key during the development and validation to make sure you're properly moving through the process. Risk can also help identify what testing needs to be done. So as you're identifying the risks of your device, one of the key ways to mitigate these is to determine what testing needs to be done. So if there is a high risk item for your device, you should probably have some sort of test developed to account for that. And that process applies for both hardware and software. So for software features, if there's a risk of data loss or using patient information, there should be appropriate cybersecurity and testing in place to show that those risks are reduced and you've validated that the software device can maintain the security of this information. Supplier assessment is the last key document in this pre-market quality system scope. So really making sure you have all of these documents in place for your foundation as you're moving through creating your device and getting it to validation. Supplier assessment is key because you want to make sure that the suppliers that you're working with are giving you good material for your device. You want to make sure that they also have quality systems. They're aware of your requirements on your quality system. And then if you order something, they provide that material or service to your specification. Also key that if they change something, they need to notify you. In the scope of the FDA and regulated environment, you are the one typically responsible for the safety and efficacy of your device. So if your supplier provides you a subpar component, it's still your responsibility to test and have control of your suppliers to make sure they're providing correct information and you're providing a safe and effective device. So supplier agreements, supplier evaluation is key. Getting into the foundations of designing and validating a device. So that's the high level overview on the quality system. This can be slightly overwhelming, but it is something that you want to really make efficient, really make it to the right size of your company, and try to do everything you can to comply with the quality system and work in it as you're developing the device. A lot of times we see companies that have built a device, and this can be hardware or software, but haven't documented anything. So in that situation, we're going to have to go back and backtrack some of these design and risk and supplier activities to make sure that everything is documented properly. It was mentioned, I think, in one of the previous slides, but this isn't optional. These quality system requirements are mandatory for medical devices. So if you're building a software or hardware medical device, you have to comply and you have to do it from the start. So really making sure you have a strong foundation when you're developing your device starts with this quality system documentation.
Hey, Kyle, can you just real quick maybe touch on, if you are let's say you're a class 1 medical device, right? So you don't actually have to submit a 510K application or something like that. What is the penalty in terms of if your quality management system is either like, if it's A, not up to par and you got audited by the FDA, or B, you didn't really have one at all? I mean, can they say, hey, you're getting dinged here, but take your product off the market if you didn't do anything, or is it that kind of discretion? Okay.
Yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, even in the scope of a class 1 or some class 2 devices that don't have to go to 510K, and even some devices that have done a 510K, we've seen situations where they didn't have a quality system. So when the FDA comes to do an audit, they will go through all of your paperwork, and the key first step is looking at your quality system, right? So they'll look at these actual procedures, they'll look at your quality manual and your document control procedure and your supplier assessment procedure to make sure that you have the procedure in place, it's been implemented, people have been trained on it, and then you're actually conducting and implementing the procedures and generating the records within your quality system. So if you don't have that, you're going to most likely get a warning letter. And then on top of that, you could be forced to recall the device, stop selling the device, destroy devices as well. So this applies for class 1 through class 3. It also applies for EUA devices. We've seen quite a few where they didn't properly do any of the testing or documentation and had to recall or destroy devices even under an EUA. So this process is mandatory even for class 1. Even if you don't submit a 510K, you still have to meet the quality system requirements under the FDA. All right, so that's kind of the high level foundation, really key to get that going as you start to develop your device. The key aspect around designing and validating your device mainly falls under the design control process. So this graphic provides an overview of design control for medical device and the different phases that you'll go through as you develop your hardware or software device. So when you're creating a device in the kind of design planning phase, you've got these different aspects of your device that you're going to identify and then document. Document being key, because this also can be reviewed by the FDA. So user needs would be high level generic user needs. We need something that is safe. We need something that is accessible by different user groups. We need a software tool that might be able to be used on a smartphone or something like that. So something that provides a general understanding of your device and how it works and who's going to use it. So for a hardware device, it might be able to connect to Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. For a mechanical device, it might need to be safe for use in the body as an implant. So these are all things that would apply to different types of devices, typically high level, but you want to identify them early in the process. And the user need term actually identifies that you might need to go talk to some of your users and identify what they want from this product as well. So when you're in the early design, planning, and iteration phase, you can actually reach out to users and see what they would need with their device. These user needs then tie to design inputs, which are kind of the specifications for your device. So this would call out specifically how big or small the device should be, how fast it needs to process information, how accurate it needs to be in diagnosing or analyzing images or some sort of disease. So this design input is actual specification for your device and something you should be able to test against. Still see my screen there, Dwayne?
Hear me? I'm on mute. Yeah, I can still see it.
Okay, cool. Design outputs are then how the specifications or design inputs are met. So your design outputs would be how you're actually going to build this device. So this for a hardware device would be like your drawing files, your schematics, your packaging files, your labeling and IFU. For a software device, it can be your wireframes, it can be your software source code. All of these things are considered design outputs for your medical device. And then we have two different types of testing. So we have verification and validation. Both are critical and both are required for medical devices for both hardware and software. And in some cases, they overlap as well. But verification would be this kind of internal loop showing that the outputs meet the inputs. So if you say your device needs to be less than 4 inches in size and weigh less than 6 ounces, you would measure and weigh your device and make sure it works. If you say it needs to give a result or needs to give a result in less than 5 minutes, you would test to show that every time you use this device, it gives you a result in less than 5 minutes. So that is kind of the verification. So it's all this testing. It can be internal, it can be external, showing that it meets the requirements. Verification can also be to external standards. So this can be like your 60601 electrical safety testing, your biocompatibility testing, all of these types of established standards, testing against those to show your device meets the requirements of these standards. And then validation is more on the clinical evidence and usability side. So this is actually using this device with users or in a usability environment, using this to show that they are able to open the device, operate the device, complete the test, operate the software, whatever it might be. So the validation is more on the clinical evidence and the usability side, showing that the device works properly and meets these user needs from your initial users. This is key to show the entire process, but also leads us to the kind of documentation of how do we actually implement each of these phases with our new device design. So yeah, going into next phase, how do we actually document this? So with the scope of the quality systems, we have procedures tell us how to do it. We've identified some of these aspects of our user needs and outputs. How should we document it? And what do we need to do to plan to get this device to market? So our best method, and has been used in a lot of different devices and a lot of different companies, is to create a design control traceability matrix. So this is referenced in ISO 13485 and also common practice in all the FDA guidances, is to create a matrix that shows your user needs and then the design input, design output, and V&V requirements. So actually listing the user needs and inputs for your device, linking that to the design output, whether that's your drawing file, schematic, material specification, bill of materials, any of those things, and then identifying what you need to do to test it. Some of this testing might be internal, some might be external, but really going through this process of documenting and showing this is key to see, do we have everything captured on our user needs and inputs? And do we have tests that identify how we're going to test everything? Not everything might not need to be tested, but you also need to go through the process of seeing everything and documenting it properly. It's also a good practice to identify how the testing can be shared and what testing will take the longest. So if there's some things like shelf life that might apply for your hardware device, you would want to plan those ahead to say, hey, it's going to take 6 months of shelf life testing, so we need to go ahead and plan for this so that we can release our device when we plan to later this year, right? So planning ahead with your testing is important. There's been multiple times where we've met with companies, say, hey, we want to submit this to the FDA and in 3 months, can you help us? And then we look at their testing plan and realize they've got 9 months of testing. So really identifying your testing plans, your V&V strategy, so that you can meet your milestones, deadlines, timelines, all of those things. So how to identify testing? So I'm sure companies that are new to this process, have never gone through it before, say, hey, we've got this great idea, we just don't know what to do. We don't know how to test it. We don't know if this testing is required. So definitely some tips and things we've helped other companies in the past on identifying the proper testing. And this can apply for both hardware and software devices. So starting with your design matrix, like I said, showing the traceability between your inputs and outputs, and then linking that to your verification and validation. You also want to look at the regulatory requirements. So within the scope of the FDA, they will list what standards or testing is required for certain types of devices. So you can review the FDA's website, their product code requirements, and see what testing is required. The FDA also has a lot of guidance documents for certain types of devices that would identify what specific testing is required. You can also identify, and with these external standards that might be referenced, if you need to do testing. So things like biocompatibility for devices that might be contacting patients or users, electrical safety for IEC 60601, wireless connectivity for software, connected devices. All of these types of things, cybersecurity, can also be referenced in your product code or in guidances. So you'll want to see if these apply, review the standards, and then determine if that applies for your device. Within the scope of actual external testing, you can also discuss it with the testing lab. I know with the biocompatibility testing, with electrical safety testing, you can reach out, have a conversation with your testing lab or facility, and get their feedback on what tests you need to do as well. There's also a way to confirm your testing plan with the FDA as well via a pre-submission meeting. So if you think you have a pretty good idea on what your device needs to do, but you're not sure, or it's a new type of device or a new twist on an established type of device, you can conduct a pre-submission meeting with the FDA, and that would allow you to propose your testing plan, get feedback from the FDA, and then also get some level of assurance that they agree with your testing. So that is a great tool as well. If you do have questions and want to confirm before you invest the time and money to start testing, we definitely would recommend using the pre-submission process as well.
Hey, Kyle, a few questions have come in. I'll save most of them for later, but one that came up was, how do you build out DMR and DHR for software as a medical device?
Yeah, so the DMR is really this kind of the design output section. So the DMR is how you build your device. So the DMR within the scope of software is really around like your software bill of materials, all the software code and tools used to launch or make your software accessible is part of your software DMR. This information, if you're using external libraries or different things such as like AWS or other tools to host your software, would be part of your software DMR, and also instructions on how you update and then make your software available, whether that's a release to like some sort of app marketplace or something like that, or some sort of hosting. You would have that information in your DMR as well for your software device. And with software, there is a lot of overlap between DMR and DHR. DHR for traditional hardware device is the actual record of you building it, With a software device, it really would be that record of you making this new version of the software accessible, whether that is when you uploaded it, whether that is when you added this new version of the software to your hosting site or whatever it might be, that or uploading it to your hardware as far as software or firmware. All that information will be part of your DHR for your software.
Awesome, thank you.
And yeah, the DMR, DHR wasn't covered a ton in here, but it does overlap a good bit with the DHF side, right? So a lot of this design control items for developing a new device is part of your DHF, but then that leads to your DMR, which is kind of the specifications on how to build each device. And then the DHR is the actual record of you building and releasing that device in the scope of software. So lots of overlap between the DHF, DMR, DHR.
Lots of overlap and lots of analogies.
Exactly, lots of acronyms.
Or abbreviations, I mean.
Exactly. All right. So some of the key testing differences between hardware and software. So again, similar overlaps, but also some of the key differences to look at, especially as you're developing a device. Also things you can consider as you're trying to determine what type of device you're going to build, right? If you're not sure if you want to use somebody else's hardware and just build software, these are things you could take into consideration as you're starting your company and planning your medical device adventure. So with hardware devices, this requires physical devices, right? So you have to have devices made to be tested. You also require supplier approval, incoming inspection, assembly, and trial and error during your first build. So it's never going to happen that you create drawings and then you send them off to a manufacturer and everything comes out perfect. That would be great, but with all of the devices we worked on, that's never happened. With a first shot, everything works great. So there will be issues, there will be things that need to be overcome. So making sure you have time and plans to account for those delays as well. You also require specific amounts of devices for testing. So you'll have to make more than one. You'll have to build accordingly based on how much testing you'll do. There might be some testing depending on your device that's destructive. So you might have to plan for that as well. The equipment that is used to build this and test it might also need calibration and validation of this equipment. So you'd have to plan ahead for that. And then timelines. You might require shelf life, testing, shipping validation, sterilization validation, external testing. So all of these things should be accounted for when you're planning out your testing strategy for your external device. So the timelines for testing hardware typically much longer than testing a SaMD or software device. For software devices, again, much faster and cheaper, much easier to fix, edit, and update. So with hardware, if something fails during testing, you might have to go back and make a design change, and then you're going back and building more and recalibrating, revalidating, retesting. So with software, if something fails, typically it's something, if you're easy to identify, you can update quickly and fix and rerun the test. With that being said, it is much harder in our experience with software devices to come to a design feature freeze. So this part is key, especially for software companies, to realize that when you're getting ready to test your software, you have to stop working on it. You have to get to a point where the design is frozen and the feature set is frozen, and then you start testing. Because all of this testing has to be formally documented, the versions have to be tracked. So you have to get to a version you're going to test, and then do the testing. If something fails, then you have to update to a new version and then do testing again. But this idea of design and feature freeze is typically a lot harder for software companies to implement, as they're always trying to update and make it better. The key, I think, for both is that you still have to document all of your testing. So you have to document your test plans, your test protocols, and your results. So that part is required for both. With software, it typically is something that is harder to implement and train companies on because they are so used to saying, oh, we tested it in our models and it looked good. The FDA and ISO requirements require a lot more documentation than typical software testing. So that's something you'll definitely want to get aware of and then in the practice of doing as you start to work in a software medical device scope.
Hey, Kyle, real quick, just to add a couple things. The part you brought up about the hardware, and if you have to change something, I used to see this a lot of times back in my biocompatibility days, right, where a material failed, sensitization or irritation, then you have to change it, or you got to change an adhesive, and you can get into a pretty vicious cycle of having to go back and repeat a lot of biocompatibility testing a lot of times in a row, and it was kind of tedious and a pain in the butt. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's I know we've seen a few times with mold release agents making companies. All the materials they bought are biocompatible and tested by themselves, and then they put it in the mold, and the mold release agents make it fail, right? So there is some of that that's also required. Even if you think all the materials are good and safe by themselves, the process of actually testing the final device and how it'll be used is important as well, because there are things that can affect that testing, whether it's handling, mold release, cleaning procedures, all of that stuff can affect this as well. All right, so that's kind of the high-level overview of the differences. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper onto hardware testing and what is required. So this is testing for your hardware devices that is mandated by FDA. So once you've identified what your regulatory requirements are for testing, we want to start to move into the actual testing phase. So this is at the point where you have come to a design freeze, you built some devices, and you're ready to show it works and then go to the FDA. So it should not be when you're still in the R&D phase. It should not be a prototype version of the device. It should be your kind of finished device ready to go to the FDA. So you're going to do testing of your kind of output specifications. So this would be any of the specific testing you've identified through your regulatory review and your risk assessments. For this testing, we're going to have to write formal protocols that say how many devices we're going to test, how we're going to test them, and what the acceptance criteria is. So we have to define before we start testing what a pass, first, fail is, and then go into testing. You can't just test and say, oh, we'll see the results and then determine what a pass, first, fail means. The other kind of aspect of this is to do the final reports, and we'll talk about that a little bit on the next slide. So identifying your test objectives, you want to identify as well your sampling. So what part of the device is being tested, the sample size, so how many devices need to be tested, and the configuration. So how this represents the clinically relevant scenario and how lot variability is accounted for. There are some general ideas of using 3 lots to reduce lot variability and using a certain number of devices. It is a lot of times tied back to risk and tied back to your confidence levels of your manufacturing. So it can get pretty complicated and very statistically heavy very quickly. So you might want to have additional support on generating these testing protocols, especially sampling plans, if you have a high risk device. Like I said, pass-fail criteria should be defined before you start, and these protocols should be approved. So you should go through the actual routing and approval process within your document control and quality system before you start testing. FDA will ask for protocols, so you should have these formally documented and approved before you start testing. And then output of this testing would be your test results. So you want to actually collect the data, have people trained on executing the protocol, and then have ways to collect the data, whether that's by hand, some sort of computer system, that you're using, have this all documented, and then you conduct data analysis, determine whether or not your acceptance criteria was met, and then determine whether or not retesting is required. If for some reason there were deviations during the testing, you need to document them and then provide justification whether or not you can use the results or you need to retest. Once the testing is complete, we will write a conclusion that says we passed or failed and identify what the next steps are. So in an ideal situation, everything went great, we move forward, we're ready to submit, but in reality, sometimes things fail and we'll have to go back and retest, make changes, tweaks, and then go from there. Again, key on this process is planning ahead, documenting formally what you're going to do. You can pre-test, right? So you can do these tests in an informal fashion, have a high level of confidence they're going to pass, and then do your final testing. So that's not against the rules. It's just when you're doing actual protocols, everything has to be actually documented formally and tested according to those protocols. Dwayne, any other thoughts on hardware testing before we go into some more software documentation?
No, that was it. Just from the biocompatibility side, it's just the things we've seen. And the only other one outside of that was even before biocompatibility, which is preclinical animal testing. Doing a non-GLP study before you dive into a GLP study and do some large animal testing. But that's all before that. So nope.
Got it. All right. So hardware, like we talked about, pretty straightforward. Lots of documentation and timelines, quite a bit more than your software. Also, do want to talk a little bit more about software devices and some of the pre-planning that goes into getting to test a software as well. From a high level, software device definition, similar to what we talked about for just general medical device, but it's software intended to be used for more than one medical purpose, for one or more medical purpose that perform these purposes without being part of the hardware device. So this is mainly just for SaMD. So it can be used to treat or diagnose, drive clinical management, inform clinical management, and then there are different categories within this as far as critical, serious, and non-serious. So we want to identify kind of where our software device falls within these categories and then go from there. Like we talked about with hardware and just medical devices in general, there are different classifications based on risk. So depending on regulatory markets, those can be different as well. But for the US FDA, there's class 1, 2, and 3. And based on that would determine what testing is required for your hardware or software devices. There's additional classification for software, both with the FDA and with the key 62304 standard that defines classifications based on risk as well. So that should be accounted for when you're developing your SaMD device as well. Within the scope of software documentation, the same principles apply regarding the quality system and the design history file. So the quality system, like we talked about, the high-level pre-market quality system should also be created before you start your SaMD device. There should be additional templates related to software that cover software development plan, verification plan, and some more detailed description of the software architecture and how it works. The requirements of the software documentation on the pre-market side, a lot of these will actually go into your FDA submission. So you want to make sure that you have them planned from the start. Unresolved anomalies is another key aspect of software documentation. So as you develop and test your software, there's going to be bugs that still need to get fixed. So you just have to make note of these as you update versions and continue to work to fix these issues. The design history file, like we talked about, just a high level and for hardware devices, includes your specifications, your user needs, your outputs or software code, and your testing. Risk analysis, also key for your software. And in the majority of software submissions, this risk analysis will be part of your FDA submission as well. When you're starting to develop your software, you want to, again, have documentation around this development process and identify what stages you will develop. So identifying how you're going to track the development and how you're going to document it, identify your software development schedule, your design process, so what code requirements and what platform you're using, the overall architecture diagram and how data is being transferred within your software and what different tools or libraries are being used, how you're going to implement the software, how it should be tested, how bugs will be tracked and fixed, and then the final software testing and maintenance. With software development, this can be completed in many different ways. There's many different processes for developing software, whether that's agile or more of a life cycle process. Regardless of this, all of these things still need to be documented, right? So regardless of the timelines or the efficiency or the speed of your development of software, you still are required to document it properly and test it properly. So this is one thing that we work with a lot of software companies, and obviously Galen does as well, that can get confused or just be majorly unaccounted for with these companies is how much documentation goes into the development process and how much documentation goes into the testing process. So it's definitely something you want to plan for as you start to get into the medical device software world, is that you're going to have to invest a lot of time and resources into documenting and testing this software.
Hey Kyle, while you're on this slide, a few questions. Do you brought up bugs? Do you suggest people track software bugs during development in their non-conformance system or have it in a separate process?
Yeah, in general, yeah, they should be documented formally. I think in the majority of the time, the non-conformance system is a little too complicated for bug tracking. So I would implement a kind of more streamlined process of identifying the bugs, documenting them of what the issue is and the risk of the bug, and then moving forward with the testing and whatever fix might be needed for that. I think that the standard NCR process can be a little bit too complicated. So typically we have a hybrid process that we implement that's a little bit more efficient and more aligned with modern software development practices.
Okay. And then you have sprints up here. Do you find that having a solid regression analysis documented between software versions in test are useful? That's the first question. The follow-up to that is any suggestions on doing these regressions quickly between sprints?
Yeah, I do think it's useful. I think having a plan on who's responsible and how this will be tested and documented is kind of key for this to maintain efficiency. We typically will have kind of a team that's more focused on the documentation side as compared to the team that's focused on the development and testing side within each sprint, and that allows each team to kind of move efficiently and then communicate if there are issues on testing and how that gets documented and then fixed, right? So I think really just make sure you have resources assigned to each phase as far as development, testing, and documentation, and that's been a good practice in our experience.
Perfect. Okay. There's some more questions, Kyle. So just out of curiosity, how many slides do you have left?
A few, 5.
Okay, cool. Well, then I'll just save some of these questions when we get closer to the end. Yep.
Yeah, so similar with software, we still want to define requirements. So user requirements and software requirements similar to your user needs, design inputs, outline performance, implementation, cybersecurity, usability of the software. Once we have these requirements defined, we are able to document testing. But we can't start testing until we have these requirements defined. So you have to have requirements defined before you can start testing. So this has to be formally captured, documented before we can start the V&V process of the software. Test plans, test cases should be created early so you can move through these different types of testing, including regression testing. With these, just like we talked about with the hardware protocols, we have to have clear entry and exit criteria, clear acceptance criteria, and clear documentation of the environment and assumptions for the testing. So what version, how it's being tested, all of that needs to be documented in this test case or test plan before we start doing the testing. Validation should be covered with the actual clinical user or user environment to actually conduct the testing. Combination. So that was kind of the quick overview. We've got about 10 minutes left on software as a medical device or SaMD. There's also plenty of devices that have both, right? They have hardware and they have software. So this is potentially like this SaMD software in a medical device. So there's definitely overlapping requirements for both. It's hard to test the software in most cases without the hardware. So a lot of times this testing will be conducted together. Same idea as before, you'll need to have formal protocols with defined acceptance criteria. Versions of the software firmware needs to be captured. In certain cases, you can have custom testing devices that verify the input and output of the firmware. Every time you update software or firmware, this testing should be rerun with the hardware as well. And then software documentation requirements still apply to firmware aspects of the device, and these will be reviewed by the FDA. So even if you have software, but it's only embedded software within the device, and you don't have like a user interface or a companion app or a dashboard, you still have software documentation requirements within the eyes of the FDA. So you still need to look into your software requirements, your software risk, your software testing to make sure all of that is properly documented as you develop the software in accordance with the hardware, and then how you test them together. So this is a gap we see quite a bit where companies think their burden on software isn't very high because it's not doing a ton of complicated work, but the FDA still wants to see that documentation as well. Within the scope of final like validation of your medical device, there's some key aspects for usability testing and clinical testing wanted to touch on. So usability is a key aspect of validation for both hardware and software, and a combination of the two. There are guidances and standards on this subject, IEC 62366 and the FDA guidance document. Users will need to interact with both the hardware and the software during the usability validation. If you have multiple user profiles, I'm going to make sure that they're tested on user groups. So this is potentially if you have a professional use device and a home use device, we've seen this a lot with COVID diagnostics, right? You have to test with both groups, the trained user versus the lay user. Pre-usability testing is also a good idea to get feedback from your users and influence different aspects of the hardware and software. So this can be early in the development process. And then the usability validation results may require updates. So if you get feedback about your device potentially being hard to use or confusing, you might want to update the hardware and or software and or labeling of your device. And then clinical testing. So clinical testing is also a key part of hardware and software validation. It might not be required for all devices, but it really depends on the classification and product code. Some high-level devices that most likely need clinical trials, many of your monitoring devices, whether that's remote monitoring, wearables, things like that. If you're doing any of these heart rate, respiration rate, things like that, you'll actually need to have the data to show it works. Diagnostic devices will need clinical trials the majority of the time. Implant devices will need clinical trials. In some cases, if it's a software device, and you're doing some sort of diagnostic work on images, you might be able to use retrospective data, but it really depends on the type of device and what you're analyzing. Just like some of the internal testing we talked about, for your clinical testing, you'll need formal protocols and reports, as well as additional documentation such as informed consent, things like that. Highly recommend, if you are unsure on what you need to do for your clinical testing, that you do reach out to your CRO, so your clinical research organization, to make sure you have a clear scope of your testing. You can also leverage the FDA for a pre-sub to make sure your clinical investigation, clinical plans meet what they want to see. Clinical testing is very expensive, so making sure you're planning ahead and meeting with the FDA is always recommended. So we are getting close to 5 minutes left. That was the last slide. Here's our contact information if you have any questions. We'll send it back over to Dwayne to see if he has any questions that came through during. Yep. Thanks again to Galen and Dwayne for hosting this.
Yeah. The only thing I'll say, Kyle, because you did have the clinical slide up too, this isn't a clinical discussion, but for all those people who are listening, the FDA should not be the only group consulted when designing your clinical trial. If you're gonna do a clinical trial, you're definitely gonna want to hit reimbursement, commercialization strategy, all those different endpoints. So keep that in mind too. We generally used to see, back to my CRO days, people miss one or the other. And so you want to try to tie in as much as you can there. Kyle, in terms of questions, we have some that I think are very straightforward, yes or no. And so I'll try to ask those first here. One of the first ones here is it typical that an outside lab tends to do your 60601 testing?
Yeah. Very, very typical. I think it's very rare that you would do that internally.
Okay. Is DHF needed for class 1 devices? And what about QMS for class 1 devices?
Yes, for both, yeah.
Okay. Flying through these. Okay. Do you have any guidance on which EQMS system to use?
Yeah, I definitely think that, there's a lot of EQMS tools out there, and it's something that would be, custom to your device. So we've helped all types of devices, big and small, evaluate EQMS and see what the best fit. For the majority of startup small devices, we recommend Greenlight Guru, out of the box solution, easy to implement and get up and running. So that's our main one that we recommend, just because we have a lot of clients that use it and it's easy to implement. There are a lot of other great tools out there as well, depending on what your device does and what type of device it is and what's important to you. Propel is one that has like a bill of materials feature for hardware devices that's good. Major requirements is good for software devices that need a lot more of the hands-on, like ALM, release tracking features. Qualio is good for customization. So if you have certain aspects of your process regarding how you want to do change orders and CAPAs and things like that, Qualio allows for more of that configuration aspect as well. And then bigger companies, Viva is a good one for bigger companies as well.
Yeah, cool. And for everyone who's listening, because I think I had that question twice or 3 times actually, Kyle's email is right here on the slide. You could feel free to just send him an email, and I'm sure Rook can help walk you through some of this.
Yep.
Kyle, how about how to use Jira? Well, I think I'm saying that right, JIRA, or similar for DHF would also be an interesting discussion.
Yeah, so we have helped companies use the Jira Confluence environment for an EQMS and validated that for them as well. This is typically software-heavy companies that are using Jira. So you can use Jira to define your requirements from user needs, user requirements, software requirements through output, and then your testing, and also use the Jira environment for your bug tracking and new release and new updates. So definitely something that can be done. We've had a lot of companies that have had success with that. There are also other EQMS tools, Greenlight, that tied to Jira as well, so you can have some information in Jira and some in the Greenlight as well. But yeah, Jira is definitely something that we have supported and validated for our clients as well.
Okay. Can you talk about the state of, in quotations, bill of materials for software as a medical device, both what is required by the regulators and the changing state of the art in the software industry? And within there, they named, I'm guessing, a couple companies, SPDX, Cyclone DX, Vex, VEX, etc.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think I'm familiar with any of those companies, but yeah, I think really the software bill of materials kind of is moving towards having a accurate and up-to-date list of all the different aspects of your software and different tools, libraries, or software features and the version of those that are supported on your software, and having that in one easy to access list. Another key aspect of that is when you go and update software, making sure you look back at these other aspects of your software BOM to make sure they are updated and incorporated in your testing as well. So that is something that has come up in audits, is if people update something, change something, they didn't go back and review their software BOM or the latest version of these external tools or libraries, and that can be an issue as well. So just making sure you have an up-to-date list of all of the aspects of your software, and then reviewing that each time you make changes or changes are made to those external tools.
Cool. Kyle, do you have time for 2 more questions?
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. So this one is a little bit longer. If we develop software algorithms for EKG, in some bespoke applications during the development of the algorithm, we develop prototype EKG hardware data logging devices for early development of the algorithm. What level of testing would be required on this hardware to allow this data to be used as test data for algorithm verification for FDA? To use this data, would the prototype hardware require the same level of testing as a full medical device?
Yeah, I think you would have to make some sort of argument showing that this data is similar to what you would get from a validated medical device before you could use it in your submission. So you would have to have some sort of argument showing why this data or this testing model is representative of what you would see with a validated medical device. We have worked on quite a few of these types of devices, so definitely something we can follow up with if they need more help, because it's not a one-word answer question, but yeah, definitely something we can look at. It can be done. It's just how you present it to the FDA, I think, is the key.
Okay. There was one more. I have one more question after this, but there was one more just came in about the Class 1 devices. The question was, aren't Class 1 devices exempt from design controls unless they're software sterile devices or otherwise required by regulation? Then they said, completely agree that DHF is always useful though.
Yeah, there are some exemptions for Class 1s. We would still recommend conducting a DHF or completing a DHF for the device itself to make sure that it actually works how it's supposed to. So if you're going to not complete a DHF, I would have a justification for that. So
okay.
And that would be more along the exempt list as well. There are certain devices that are exempt from GMP. We still recommend completing a DHF. It might not be as rigorous as a Class 2 device, but still recommended.
Cool. And then this is the last one. Can you speak to the idea that even software as a medical device has a quote unquote shelf life?
Yeah, so you still want to define sort of a life cycle of the device and how it will be put out of service. I don't think that's necessarily a shelf life. I've never used the term shelf life for software as a medical device, but you still have a life cycle and a potential like end of life for the software, and that would apply for a software device.
Okay, cool. All right, Kyle, I appreciate you answering all the questions. Thank you for the presentation. As always, I learn a ton when we get to chat. Thanks, Galen Data, for putting on another great webinar, the 28th one. And everyone who attended, thanks for attending. And please be on the lookout for February's Galen Data webinar series. So thanks everyone for joining today.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dwayne.